What would it take to erase an empire? Not just to defeat it, not just to conquer it, but to erase it so completely that within a few generations, nobody could even remember its name. In 401 BCE, a Greek army of 10,000 soldiers was retreating across what is now northern Iraq. Their commander was a man named Xenophon, a soldier, a philosopher, a former student of Socrates, and he would later write the whole story down. In his account, there's a strange detail. As his army marched, they passed something they couldn't explain. Vast ruins, walls 50 feet thick, towers of broken brick stretching as far as the eye could see. A dead city, abandoned to the desert, so enormous that Xenophon couldn't believe it had ever been inhabited. He asked the locals what it was. They didn't know. They had stories, vague ones, about a king who had once ruled here. But the name of the city was gone. The name of the empire was gone. The people who had built these walls had been forgotten. Xenophon was standing in the ruins of Nineveh, capital of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. 2 centuries earlier, its kings had ruled from the Nile to the mountains of Iran. They had conquered Egypt. They had broken Babylon. They had built libraries, palaces, and a war machine that terrorized every civilization around them for 300 years. And within 2 generations of their fall, no one even remembered who they were. This is the story of Assyria, the empire that vanished. The Assyrians had been in northern Mesopotamia for a long time, before anyone outside the region noticed them. Their heartland was the upper Tigris, in what is today northern Iraq. Tough country, colder than Babylon to the south. More exposed to raids from the mountains. For most of their early history, Assyria was a middle power, overshadowed by the great Bronze Age states around them. The Hittites to the north, the Egyptians to the west, the Babylonians to the south. Then, around 1200 BCE, something happened that historians still argue about. Across the eastern Mediterranean, civilization collapsed. Cities were burned. Kingdoms vanished. The Hittite Empire, gone. The Mycenaean Greeks, gone. Egypt was nearly broken. Assyria survived it. Battered, smaller, poorer, but intact. And in the centuries that followed, while everyone else was rebuilding from rubble, Assyria began to expand. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria had become something the ancient world had never seen before. It wasn't just an empire, it was a permanent military state, organized around the idea that war was the normal condition of life and peace was the exception. They had a standing professional army, one of the first in history. Soldiers paid by the state, trained by the state, kept under arms year-round. While other ancient armies were essentially seasonal militias of farmers who went home at harvest, the Assyrians could fight in any month, in any weather, on any front. They specialized. Heavy infantry with iron weapons, charioteers, cavalry. They were among the first to use cavalry as a serious military arm. Siege specialists with battering rams, siege towers, and sapping tunnels for undermining city walls. And they used terror as policy. The Assyrians didn't just defeat enemies. They advertised what they did to them. Their royal inscriptions, carved on palace walls, distributed across the empire, boast about flayings, impalements, mass deportations. Cities burned with their inhabitants inside. One inscription describes building a pillar of bodies at the gate of a defeated city. Another describes covering the wall with the skins of rebel leaders. Modern historians debate how much of this was real, but that debate misses the point. The Assyrians wanted everyone to think they did these things. The cruelty was the strategy. If a city resisted, this was what would happen. If a city surrendered, it would be spared. The brutality wasn't the goal, submission was. The brutality was the advertisement. It worked for nearly 300 years. The empire reached its peak under a sequence of warrior kings who, between them, rebuilt Assyria into a world-conquering force. The first was Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to power in 745 BCE. He reformed the army, the provincial system, and the bureaucracy. He institutionalized mass deportation, moving conquered populations hundreds of miles to break up local identities. Over the centuries that followed, hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted. By some estimates, the total reached into the millions. Then came Sargon II. He took his name deliberately, after Sargon of Akkad, the legendary first emperor in human history. He destroyed the kingdom of Israel and deported its population. He defeated the kingdom of Urartu in what is today Armenia. He built an entirely new capital from scratch, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon, constructed in less than a decade. And then he died in battle in 705 BCE, somewhere in the mountains of Anatolia. The first Assyrian king ever killed on campaign. His body was never recovered. His son, Sennacherib, succeeded him. Sennacherib moved the royal seat to Nineveh and transformed it into the largest city in the world, building palaces, gardens, aqueducts. It was Sennacherib who turned the city. Xenophon would later walk past in ruins into the wonder of the ancient world. Sennacherib also did something that shocked even his contemporaries. In 689 BCE, after years of Babylonian rebellion, he sacked Babylon itself, the holiest city in Mesopotamia, the cultural heart of the region. And he didn't just sack it, he destroyed it. He diverted the waters of the Euphrates to flood the ruins. He carried off the statues of its gods. He boasted in his inscriptions that he had erased Babylon from existence. It was an act of policy, taken to its furthest possible extreme, and it would be remembered. When Assyria itself fell, 80 years later, the Babylonians would return the favor with interest. Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons. The succession went to a younger son named Esarhaddon, who fought a brief civil war to secure the throne. And Esarhaddon did something no Assyrian king had done before. He conquered Egypt. In 671 BCE, an Assyrian army marched across the Sinai Desert and took Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt. The pharaoh fled south. For the first time in 3,000 years, Egypt was ruled by a foreign king from a foreign capital. The Nile, the pyramids, the temples of Karnak, all of it now answered to Nineveh. The empire had reached its peak, from the Persian Gulf to the Nile, from the mountains of Iran to the coast of Anatolia. It was the largest empire in human history up to that point. The scholar king Ashurbanipal ruled from 669 to around 631 BCE. He was in most ways exactly what an Assyrian king was supposed to be. He led armies, he hunted lions, he smashed cities. He put down a massive rebellion led by his own brother, who had been given Babylon to rule. The civil war lasted 4 years. Ashurbanipal won. He took Babylon, executed his brother's allies, and is said to have starved his brother to death in a tower. He campaigned against the kingdom of Elam in modern-day Iran, destroying the ancient city of Susa so thoroughly that its surviving inhabitants were paraded through Nineveh, wearing the severed heads of their kings around their necks. He sent agents across the empire with orders to find every clay tablet they could and bring it to him. religious texts, astronomical observations, medical manuals, magic spells, mathematical tables, histories, letters, poetry. He wanted all of it. He built it into a library at his palace in Nineveh, the first systematic library in human history. By the time he died, it held tens of thousands of tablets. The accumulated written knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization gathered into one place for the first time. The Assyrian Empire died fast. In 631 BCE, Ashurbanipal was gone. Within 20 years, every Assyrian city of any importance had been sacked. Every Assyrian king was dead or in flight, and the empire that had ruled the known world for 3 centuries had ceased to exist. After Ashurbanipal's death, his sons fought a civil war for the throne. The empire turned its army on itself for the better part of a decade, and the people Assyria had spent 300 years brutalizing were finally strong enough and united enough to fight back. In 626 BCE, the Babylonians rebelled, successfully, under a king named Nabopolassar. They allied with the Medes, a rising power in what is now western Iran. Together, these two armies began closing in on the Assyrian heartland, and in 612 BCE, they arrived at Nineveh. Nineveh was supposed to be unbreakable, walls broad enough to ride a chariot along the top, towers every 60 feet, a double moat. The city had stood as the imperial capital for more than 100 years and had never been threatened. The siege lasted 3 months. Then the city fell. Nineveh was taken, sacked, and burned to the ground. The palaces were set on fire, the royal records were destroyed. The Assyrian king, a man named Sin-shar-ish-kun, died in the burning of his own palace. The Babylonians had taken their revenge. 80 years after Sennacherib had tried to erase their city from history, they returned the favor. Nineveh would not be rebuilt. Its name would fade. Its kings would be forgotten. Empires fall. That's not unusual, but most fallen empires leave something behind: a successor state, a religion, a written language, a memory. Rome fell, but Latin survived. Even after Egypt was conquered, the pyramids remained. Assyria left almost nothing. The Babylonians who replaced them deliberately suppressed Assyrian memory. The cities themselves were never rebuilt. Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad, all of them were abandoned, picked over for stone, and slowly buried by wind and silt and time. By the time the Persians took over the area in the 6th century BCE, Assyria was already becoming a memory. Then by the time Xenophon and his 10,000 marched past those impossible walls in 401 BCE, the memory was almost gone. For over 2,000 years, that was all anyone knew. The empire that had ruled the world had been so thoroughly forgotten that scholars in 18th century Europe weren't entirely sure it had been real. In 1842, a young Englishman named Austen Henry Layard arrived in the Ottoman province of Mosul. Layard wasn't a trained archaeologist. There wasn't really such a thing as archaeology yet. He was an adventurer, a traveler, a man with a hunch that the strange mounds rising out of the plain along the Tigris might be more than just hills. He started digging, and almost immediately, he started finding things. Stone bulls with human faces and eagle wings, the size of small buildings. Reliefs of bearded kings spearing lions from chariots. Cuneiform tablets, thousands of them. Walls covered in inscriptions, in a script no one had read for over 2,000 years. He had found Nimrud, and then Nineveh, and then beneath the burned ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace, he found the library. the clay tablets that Ashurbanipal had spent decades collecting. When Nineveh burned in 612 BCE, the fire that destroyed the city baked the tablets harder. Clay that would have crumbled over the centuries was fired into something almost like ceramic. The library wasn't destroyed by the fall of the empire. It was preserved by it. Layard and the scholars who came after him dug up tens of thousands of these tablets. Over the rest of the 19th century, the cuneiform script was deciphered, and the long, detailed history of an empire the world had agreed to forget began to come back. The Assyrians had spent 300 years trying to make sure no one would ever forget them. They failed. They were forgotten almost completely. And then by an accident of fire, a king who loved books gave them back to us. There's a temptation, when you tell this kind of story, to make it into a moral. The cruel empire fell. The terror state was destroyed. Their memory was erased because they deserved erasure. But history is rarely that clean. The empires that came after Assyria, Babylon, Persia, eventually Rome, borrowed almost everything from the Assyrian model. Professional armies, provincial governance, imperial highways, the deliberate use of terror as a political tool. The Assyrians were forgotten, but the things they invented kept on shaping the world for the next 2,500 years. What's gone isn't the legacy, it's the people. The men who built those walls, the scribes who copied those tablets, the soldiers who marched those roads, the king who collected books and lost his empire. They wanted to be remembered. They built monuments to make sure of it. And every one of them, every single name, has simply disappeared. If we know anything about them now, it's because some of their writing happened to survive a fire. That's the entire reason. One library, in one burning city, in one fallen empire, on one night in 612 BCE. Civilizations don't survive on their own terms. They survive by accident. Subscribe for more moments that defined history.